Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here today to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, which is really this idea of productive struggle. For so long, we have heard a lot of messaging around how, as teachers and as educators, we need to rescue our students from struggle. But I find that cheats students of the learning process. And so today we're going to talk about productive struggle versus destructive struggle and how to help our students struggle the right way. So we're going to start out by telling you a little bit about me. Just so that you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with me, I'm a former high school English teacher. I am a former middle school administrator in large school district outside of Washington, D.C. In 2006, I think it was, I started Mindsteps, Inc., right around the time when I wrote one of my first books, Never Work Harder Than Your Students. Since then, I've written 10 books, including Never Work Harder Than Your Students and, excuse me for a moment, and I've also written books for administrators. The companion book for that is Never Underestimate Your Teachers. And a lot of my work has been around this idea of helping every student get access to rigorous instruction, helping students who are struggling reach for higher heights in terms of their learning, and helping teachers find ways to motivate their students to stay involved, stay engaged, and become more engaged in their own learning. So today, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about productive struggle. But in case you're wondering if you're in the right place, today is for you if you see your students caught in this free fall of failure and you don't know what to do to get them on the right track, or if your students give up easily or refuse to try at all, or your students may just want to be spoon-fed. They only want to do work that you give them. They don't take initiative in their classroom, or they don't take any risk in your classroom. Today is for you if you're experiencing any of those things in your classroom. Because what you're going to learn today is you're going to learn the difference between productive and destructive struggle, and you're going to learn why it matters. You're also going to learn specific strategies that you can use in your own classroom right away to foster productive struggle with your students, and to protect them from destructive struggle. And those strategies will include a few small tweaks that will make this huge amount of difference for your students. And then finally, you're going to learn how to break the cycle of failure and how to help students turn their struggles into really powerful learning experiences, so that even when students who are currently not doing well or not being successful in school, we're going to turn them around. We're going to turn those experiences around, show them how to struggle the right way, and that'll help them become more engaged, more involved in their own learning, more willing to take risks, less satisfied with just being spoon-fed the work. And so this is really, really critical. So here's my promise. We only have about an hour together, and I'm going to give you as much as I can in the next hour. But of course, I'm not going to be able to give you everything in the short time that we have together. But don't worry, because I'm going to give you the opportunity to go deeper on this topic at the end of the presentation. I'll show you how you can get more information. Plus, we'll save this webinar. It's going to be archived in the webinar archives in the free assessment for learning community on EdWeb, so that you'll be able to revisit this webinar and go through it again. I'm also going to save some time at the end to answer your questions. So please go ahead, type your questions in. They'll be saving them for me. I'll try to keep track of the chat while I'm also working through the slides. Do me a favor, even right now, those of you who are here on the webinar live, do me a favor and just type in the chat box that you can see me, you can see the slides, you can hear me okay. I've been watching. I see that we've got folks from everywhere. We've got folks from Colorado and Georgia and California and Washington and New Jersey. Lots of folks from New Jersey, Arizona, North Carolina, Raleigh. So thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend time with me. And I see, they're coming through in the chat. You can see everything okay. You can hear everything. And you're excited, Tulsa, Oklahoma, about this topic. And so I'm excited too. And Kathy, you're excited. That's good. So send me that good energy throughout this webinar, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you, everybody. Okay, so let me ask you a question. Have you ever spent your lunch periods, your mornings, your after school time working with a struggling learner only to see them fail anyway. I mean, you pour all this time, this energy helping a student, and at the end of the day, the student either gives up or he fails, or maybe they're working really hard and yet they're so far behind that it seems like they can never ever get up. Anybody have that experience? Or maybe this one, you tried to convince a struggling student to keep trying even though they really weren't getting anywhere. I mean, have you ever had that sinking feeling when you've seen a student kind of give up? Have you ever watched kids give up and not known what to do about it? So I see some of you, Kathy is saying yes to all, and Tanya is saying yeah, and Rosina, I think it's Rosina, yeah, and Jenny. Okay, so Lisa, so you're all saying this, you're having this experience with your students, and it's so frustrating. And as frustrating as it is for us, it's also frustrating for the kids. It's much more frustrating for our kids. And so it's not that we don't want our students to struggle, because real learning only happens when you struggle. Real learning only happens when you reach for it. So it's really important that our students struggle, but helping them struggle the right way is really what we're going to talk about today, so that we don't have these experiences. Because you're right, Bernadette, it is heartbreaking. It is so heartbreaking to see this. And so many of us have had these experiences with our own students. So this is going to be what we're going to spend our time talking about today. And I've got good news for you, because here's the thing, not all struggle is bad. In fact, real learning requires struggle. Real learning is a direct result of struggle. Not only that, our job is not to rescue students from struggle. Our job is to keep students struggling productively, not destructively. So that's a real shift in how we thought about struggle in years past. In years past, we thought if a student's struggling, oh, I've got to go do something. But in reality, if our students are struggling, as long as they're struggling the right way, as long as they're struggling productively, then we're doing our jobs. Okay, so you can turn destructive struggle into productive struggle, and you can help students develop grit and resilience and persistence along the way, and that's what we're going to be learning here today. Now, there are 4 big reasons why students typically struggle in school. The first one is a lack of background knowledge. Our students are coming to us with huge holes in their learning, huge gaps in their learning. And that means that when they are engaging with new material, a lot of times they're lost. The second reason is that a lot of times students have a lack of conceptual understanding. So think about this when you're teaching math. Our students can go through the procedures of solving a particular problem, but if they don't have a good sense of numeracy, if they don't have a conceptual understanding of what addition is really all about, or subtraction, or division, or multiplication, then even if they can go through the steps of solving the problem, they don't understand what they're doing. And that happens a lot. And that means that at some point, our students are going to struggle. The third reason that students struggle is a lack of practice and a lack of fluency. So maybe they get it. Maybe they have the conceptual understanding, but what if they don't have the practice or the fluency, or they haven't had enough time to work with it to really get good at it? And the fourth reason why students struggle is a lack of soft skills. Now, what do I mean by soft skills? I mean those skills that are really about understanding how to be successful in school. So things like, I know how to raise my hand and hold on to what it is I'm about to say and wait patiently until I'm called on. I know how to study. I know how to prepare for a test. I know how to take a test. I know how to ask for help when I'm struggling. I know when I'm struggling. I know how to recognize when I'm struggling. All of those are soft skills. And so these 4 reasons cover, I would say, 80 to 90% of why our students are struggling. So we have to make sure that as we're addressing that destructive struggle, we address it by addressing these 4 issues. And so someone here, Kristen's asking, why are they called soft skills? Well, soft skills is a name that I call it because I want to distinguish these skills from some of the other more for lack of a better word, hard skills that happen in the classroom, like addition and subtraction, and knowing how to read, and knowing how to use context clues, or knowing lab procedures, or the scientific method. Those are skills that are taught in school, but soft skills are those things that are often not taught in school. They're skills that kids have to pick up and learn on their own. They're skills that kids have to figure out. Okay. And then someone's asking, Gail is asking, where does motivation enter into the equation? Well, Gail, we're going to talk about that as we go through each of these things and we go through the cycle of failure. Motivation fluctuates. It's different at different times. And so we're going to specifically address motivation as we go through it. So before we get to that, though, I want to make sure that we understand the difference between productive struggle and destructive struggle. You see, productive struggle allows students the space to grapple with information, to come up with a solution on their own. So we're not interfering with productive struggle, and it gives students space. They're grappling with things, they're figuring it out. Oftentimes you can tell that a student is struggling productively when you go and offer them help and they say, no, don't tell me, let me figure it out. Then you know a student is struggling productively. Destructive struggle, on the other hand, is where students can't see how their struggle is going to produce any desired result. So when you go and offer them help, they look like they've already given up. They don't actually believe that the help that you offer them is going to make a real difference. Productive struggle develops resilience, it develops persistence. The more that kids struggle productively, the more resilient they become, the less devastated they are when they meet failure, the more persistent they become, because they've had experience that shows them that when I persist, when I continue to work at it, I can get it. Destructive struggle, on the other hand, is where students feel like their efforts are in vain and they get frustrated and they give up in a lot of cases. Productive struggle is about helping kids refine their own strategies for learning. So it's really about helping kids learn how to learn and what strategies work best for them. Destructive struggle reinforces students' continued use of strategies that don't work. So if a student is struggling, and they're struggling every single time that there's a test coming up, for instance, and every single time we tell them, you just have to study harder, you just have to try harder, all we're doing is reinforcing strategies or approaches that haven't worked. What if instead we said, tell me how you're studying for this test. Show me how much time you spend. What study strategy are you using? In fact, I know some teachers who at the end of the test, the last two questions are, one, how long did you study for this test? And two, what study strategies did you use for this test? And then after students receive the corrected test, once the test has been turned in and graded and returned to the students, the teacher has them be metacognitive and say, you know what? Okay, now look at your test results. Can you attribute those test results to either how long you studied or the strategy that you used to study? And then have students kind of start assessing whether or not they're spending enough time or they need a different strategy, and then set goals for the next assessment. So as students are taking those assessments, they're also kind of analyzing their own study process. So that will help students struggle productively rather than destructively. Now, the last difference is that in productive struggle, learning goals are not only clear, but they feel achievable. Students actually feel like, even though that goal seems far right now, at some point I'm going to reach that goal. Whereas in destructive struggle, the learning goals are not only unclear, I don't even know why I'm here, I don't even know why I'm learning. They also feel impossible. So that's the difference, and that's what we have to keep in mind. And what we're also doing is that when we're watching our students, we're always monitoring whether or not they're in productive struggle or whether they're in destructive struggle. Now, we're going to go a little deeper at this point and really get specific and looking at the difference between the two. So the big difference is that destructive struggle has the 3 Ps, okay? So the first P is that destructive struggle feels permanent. So students who are struggling feel like they will always struggle. They'll never get it. So you'll hear students say things like, well, I'm just not good at math, or I'll never get this, or I don't like to read. So it feels permanent. The second thing is that destructive struggle feels persistent. It feels like no matter what I do, it's going to stick around, and it feels pervasive. The last thing is that it feels like not only am I struggling in this area, but not only am I always going to struggle, not only am I never going to be able to get out of the struggle, but it also feels pervasive. It feels like I'm going to be struggling not just in this particular assignment, but in everything that has to do with it, everything that has to do with math. So there are a couple of questions that I want to kind of address now. And the first one is from Tanya, and she says, what do you do with kids who are productively struggling versus destructively struggling on the same task? Tanya, that's a very good question, and we are going to actually address that when we talk about the cycle of failure. And then Anise, I think it is, from TNEC, is asking, what about students who don't like a class, or if it's an elective like music or art, students can struggle because they don't care about the class. Well, typically when students don't care about the class, they're not struggling. they're not trying. So that's a different conversation. And that's really a conversation about motivation, how you keep kids motivated, how you get kids engaged and motivated in a class they don't like. But they're not struggling if they don't care. It's the students who are trying and failing. Those are the students that we're talking about for this conversation. Okay, so how do you help? How do you keep students struggling productive rather than destructive? How do you make sure the struggle is productive rather than destructive? Okay, well, let me introduce you to the cycle of failure. Now, here's the cycle of failure. Now, I, like any good teacher, stole this. This is actually a cycle of change, and it's a research-based cycle about what happens to people when they go through the change process. But I like it because I think it does a really good job of capturing what's happening with students during the cycle of failure. So the first thing is that when students start out in a year or in a class or something like that, they always start out with this uninformed optimism. So first day of school is coming up for many of you, and your kids are going to come back and are going to say things like, this year I'm not going to have any failing grades, or this year is the year I'm going to finally conquer math, or they look at an assignment and they think, you know what, this will take me 3 minutes, or this is easy. So there's some sort of uninformed optimism. And then as they engage with the material a little bit more, then the reality starts to hit it. And so there's an informed pessimism. And that informed pessimism, if we're not careful, quickly descends into the valley of despair. And the valley of despair is where students are really struggling the most destructively. This is when they're giving up, they're frustrated, they're not trying anymore. That's when those 3 P's are really involved in there. And then the next one is informed optimism. So if they can get out of the valley of despair, now they have a really good assessment of what they need to do to be successful. And now they really feel like they could be successful. And then there's a very quick leap from informed optimism to real success. So we're going to talk about this cycle and what you need to do at each point in the cycle of failure to intervene to help students who are struggling at that particular level or that particular area get to the point where they're struggling productively, not destructively. Now, before I do that, let me address a few more questions. So Christina's asking, how do you change destructive struggle to more positive ways of showing students it's not always a negative thing? Christina, we're going to talk about it, and a lot of it depends on where they are in this cycle, because you'll need a different approach depending on where students are. And then looks like there's another question. How optimistic teachers should be so as to support their students? And so really understanding that you have to, as teachers, we also go through this process, and we need to make sure that we stay in informed optimism, and we're not giving kids false hope. We're being very realistic with kids, and yet still having that unwavering faith. It's in Never Work Harder Than Your Students, I talk about that balance with expectations, right? You know, that we know that high expectations matter and that optimism matters, but uninformed optimism doesn't serve anybody. So how do you hold on to high expectations? Well, there's a paradox here, and it's called the Stockholm paradox. And the first half is that you have to be brutally honest about the facts and about the reality that you're facing. But you also have to maintain unwavering faith that no matter what the obstacles, you will prevail. Keeping that balance is hard, but that's really where a teacher should be. That's the level of optimism that we have to have with our students. We have to be brutally honest and confront the brutal reality that we're facing. But we also have to maintain unwavering faith that no matter how brutal that reality is, we will prevail. So let's go ahead and tackle it. So first we're going to deal with uninformed optimism. If your students are at uninformed optimism, what intervention do they need to keep that struggle productive? So remember, uninformed optimism says, you know what, I'm walking into this assignment and I think I can read this novel in 3 hours, so I'm not going to read it until the night before it's due. Or I'm going to sit down and tackle my homework and it's only going to take me 20 minutes, when in reality the homework is going to take a lot longer. Or that test, I don't need to study for it, it's going to be easy. So then students don't study, and then they start to struggle with that material later on. The key to dealing with uninformed optimism is that you have to anticipate confusion. When you do that, you can prevent destructive struggle by putting supports in place ahead of time before students begin to struggle. Because what happens when students are in uninformed optimism, they hit the first snag, the first piece of struggle, and they start to give up. They start to panic because they didn't expect it. But if you show them that even though they didn't expect it, you expected it, you can keep them from panicking, and you can also help manage their struggle because you put supports in place ahead of time. This is so important. The more proactive you are with students in the beginning, the better equipped they're going to be, the better you're going to keep them out of that valley of despair. So when students are in uninformed optimism, you've got to make sure that you have, even though they don't anticipate the challenges and the confusion, that you've anticipated the challenges and confusion. And you might even want to say to students, now, right now, this seems really easy, but there's a piece coming up that's going to be really challenging. And so I want to tell you about it ahead of time so that you can anticipate it. And I also want to tell you that there are some ports that I have in place so that when you hit that snag, and you will, you'll be ready for it. Doing that keeps students struggling productively, because when they hit that snag, that doesn't mean they give up. In fact, they know that you've prepared for them. They know that you have something in place to support them. So it's important that you anticipate confusion ahead of time. That way, when students move from that, kind of uninformed optimism and they start hitting to that informed pessimism, that you can head that off at the pass. So you're going to have to make the path to success very clear. And the way you do that, I don't want to just say kind of anticipate confusion, because that's something that we say to teachers a lot. But what does that really mean? It means that you have to make the pathway to success very clear for students. You have to be very clear about what is important for students to know or be able to do. And that's a planning piece. A lot of times, and I find this really shocking, when I'm working with teachers in workshops in schools, and I'll sometimes I'll do coaching days in schools where I'll work with small groups of teachers to help them work through planning issues or assignment issues. And a lot of times I'll ask them, what standard are they teaching and why are they teaching that standard? And they don't know. They can't answer. If you can't answer what your standard is, if you can't understand what your standard is, if you don't understand the key concepts, the key content, and the key context in which students have to learn those content and concepts, if you don't know that ahead of time, then it's no wonder your students are confused. It's no wonder that they're struggling. You have to be very clear about that. And what I find a lot of times is that we don't take the time that we should be taking to really understand, not just here's what the standard says, but this is why it's important. So once you think through that, then the next thing you're going to do is say, how will you help? How will you and how will your students know that they know it? And this is where your assessments come in. So what's the sign to you and to your students that they have gotten those key concepts and those key skills? And then what happens when they don't get it the first time? What happens when they don't get it the first time? A lot of times we assume that when we teach it, of course they're going to get it. But we have to think about that. Are there alternate ways we need to be explaining it? Or, when they struggle, what does that struggle really signify? What does it really mean? And are we prepared to deal with it, to address it? So when I talk about anticipating confusion, what I'm really talking about is during the planning process, you take yourself through these 3 questions. And if you can't answer these 3 questions clearly, you're not ready to share that lesson with your students. Okay, now we're going to go to informed pessimism. So let's say that your students are in informed pessimism. They have tried it, they're starting to struggle, they're starting to see, this is a little harder than I thought it was going to be. Now what do you do with those students? So the antidote is acceleration. Now, acceleration is a strategy that I learned over 10 years, well, probably about 15 years ago now. And I actually used it in my own classroom. So this is not a theory that I read about. This is something that I have seen work in my own classroom and in hundreds of other classrooms where I have shared this information or provided support and coaching for teachers in the classroom. And what acceleration does is it sets students up for success by giving them the tools they'll need to struggle productively. And so what we do oftentimes is we wait for students to struggle and then we come in and provide supports. Acceleration says, no. You don't wait for a kid to struggle to provide supports. You provide supports so that you can direct the kind of struggle that they have. So if you are preparing a presentation, a lesson on, let's say you're preparing a lesson where students are going to be doing two-step equations. And you want to make sure that the students know their math facts, that they are really strong in addition and subtraction and multiplication and division, because that's coming up. Well, rather than waiting for kids to get stuck because they really don't know the multiplication tables, why not a couple of days before that assignment, review the multiplication tables, make sure that they've shored up in that area, and then that way they're ready when it's time for that lesson. Or let me give you another example. Let's say that you're going to be reading a story in class, and that story requires a lot of background knowledge. Well, rather than waiting for students to struggle with the story because of a lack of background knowledge, why not 2 days before you read the story, do a mini lesson where you shore up their background knowledge or help them get the background knowledge that they need, so that when you read the story, it's familiar, they know it, they understand it, they're not going to struggle in that way. They can struggle with the parts you really want them to struggle with, rather than getting stuck on the parts that really get in the way of productive struggle. So what you need to do is you really need to focus on setting kids up to be successful so that they can struggle on the right things and are not struggling on the wrong things. And how do you know what to accelerate? Well, remember those 4 things I gave you at the beginning, the 4 big reasons why students struggle. Those are excellent areas to accelerate. So is it background knowledge that they need? Is it soft skills? I remember one time, and I tell the story at the time, I was teaching 11th grade English, and my students were not finishing the novels that they were required to read on time. And I was getting really frustrated, and I thought they didn't care, and it was a lack of motivation. And finally, I said, you know what? Maybe it's a lack of soft skills. They don't know how to manage their time right. So the next novel that they read, when I passed it out, I said, okay, before we go, this is your new novel, it's due in 2 weeks. Before we get started, I'm going to give you a quiz on the first 2 pages. So I want you to read the first 2 pages and read them so thoroughly that you'll be ready for the quiz. When you finish the first 2 pages, I'm going to put a timer up on the board. When you finish the first 2 pages, I want you to write down your time. Kids read. Some kids took 2 minutes, some kids took 5 minutes, some kids took 7 minutes. And so they wrote down their time. And then I said, multiply the number of pages in the book by your time and divide that by 2. Kids did that. And I said, okay, so that's approximately how long it's going to take you to read this particular novel. So now let's take out your plan books and let's figure out where you're going to schedule the 8 hours it's going to take you, or the 5 hours it's going to take you, or the 10 hours that it's going to take you to read this novel. And so we sat down and we scheduled when they were going to read the novel. The next time the novel was due, instead of having 50% of the class not finished, I actually had 3 kids who hadn't finished, and all 3 kids said, I just didn't stick to my schedule. So sometimes what acceleration will do is it will help students, it takes away the distractions, the reasons that kids struggle destructively, and it sets them up so that when they struggle, they are struggling productively. So let me give you another kind of explanation of acceleration. Another thing you can do is you can make sure that you preview background knowledge or preview vocabulary, or you could preview organizing strategies or learning strategies. So let's say you're going to be reading a story in an elementary classroom, and let's say you have some students who are really struggling readers. Why not give them a story map of the story? So you're not reading the story ahead of time, but you're giving them a story map so that they can see how the plot falls together, so that when they actually read the story, they can struggle with the things that readers should be struggling with because they're not lost. Let's say you're teaching a science lesson and you want to go through, and it has a lot of heavy vocabulary in it. They're going to read an article in science, or they're going to be going to a lecture or listening to a lecture in science. Why not preview the vocabulary so that when they hear it again in that lecture, or they encounter it again in that scientific article, they're not struggling over the vocabulary. Instead, they're struggling with the concepts and the ideas. Now, we've talked about what we do for students who are informed optimism and how we keep them out of it. We've talked about, okay, when if they're uninformed optimism, and then they go to informed pessimism. Now what? Now they're in the valley of despair. So you've done some things to prevent them, and there's still a few students who may slip down into the valley of despair, or they may already come to you in the valley of despair. So what do you do with students who are down there? Well, these students have a different issue, a different concern. These students are struggling destructively, and as destructively as it comes. So how do you help these students? Well, this is where you have to get a little bit more involved, and you're going to do something called what I call proactive intervention. And what proactive intervention does is it gives students the support that they need in the midst of their struggle so that you can take that struggle, that destructive struggle, and turn it into productive struggle. So here's the success plan that I use. And we won't have time to go into it deeply today, but if you are interested, I'll tell you where you can get some more detailed information on how to make the success plan work. But here's the success plan. The S in success stands for setting students up for success. So we've already talked about that. Acceleration, previewing things, making sure that you have the pathway clear, anticipating confusion. All those things are setting them up for success. The U in success stands for uncover or create background knowledge. So after you set them up, there's some background knowledge they need to be successful. How can you uncover and create that background knowledge? Now the C, the first C, is about creating mastery thresholds. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. Mastery thresholds are the baseline for mastery. So, we may all want our students to get 100% on every single test, but if a student got 80% on the test, would that be okay? Would that show that the student really has some of the basic concepts down pat? So what you have to do is for each assignment, each major summative assessment, you have to think about what's the mastery threshold. Sometimes that mastery threshold will be 80%. Sometimes it'll be 7 problems. Sometimes it'll be, I don't care what other problems they get wrong. If they get this problem wrong, there's a real hole in their understanding. Sometimes it's going to be 100%. So take the example of, let's say you want the students to know all 50 states. Well, if I know 49 out of the 50 states, even though that is technically an A, it's not mastery because the whole point is I need to know all 50 states. So you have to set what that mastery threshold is going to be. And then, and this is where the assessment for learning comes into place, once you have those mastery thresholds, you're going to create ongoing assessments that help you figure out where students are in relationship to those mastery thresholds. And then, once you figure that out, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to establish red flags. So let me give you an example of a red flag. If I want my students to know 25 sight words by the end of October, on September 30th, I'm going to give them an ongoing assessment. And any student who doesn't know 25 sight words on September 30th, that's a red flag for me. And so that's my red flag. And so as I'm grading those assessments, I've got above 25 and above on one stack, less than 25 on the other stack, and those students get an immediate support or intervention. And so the S stands for you set up progressive support. So once I see that a student has triggered a red flag, I have to have a progressive support rather than figuring, oh no, my student's failing, what do I do? Every red flag immediately comes with a support. So I figure that out ahead of time. So once I see a student triggering a red flag, I say bingo, and I immediately give them that support. This is so important for kids who are in the valley of despair because those kids, they often feel, remember, that their struggle is permanent, it's pervasive, and they also feel like it's really personal, like it's mine, it's me, it's my fault. I'm the reason why I'm struggling. So what you're doing is, once students start, the moment you see them starting to struggle destructively, that red flag gets triggered, and then the support comes in place to get that turning it around ahead of time. And the reason you want to do it ahead of time and not in the midst of it is because what happens when it's 5 students, 10 students, 30 students who are struggling? If you're trying to figure it out in the midst of their struggle, you're not thinking clearly, and your kids can see that you're desperate, and that feeds their desperation. So the last one is then you select appropriate remediation strategies. So after you've gotten some supports, you want to test again, see how they're doing. If they're still struggling, then you want to do some more remediation strategies, and then that's what you're doing. So now, here's a big question. Someone's asking, I teach 500 students a week in grades K through 8. So I'm guessing that you're probably an arts teacher, either or an electives teacher. So you're teaching PE or one of the arts or music. This is why, if you're teaching 500 kids a week, you have to do the success plan because you'll go crazy without it. By setting this all up ahead of time, and this is something you can use the rest of your summer to do, even if the rest of your summer is 2 days. This is something that you do ahead of time because when you're in the midst of it, when you're just trying to learn 500 kids' names, and I'm guessing you probably don't have those same 500 kids all year long that they're using, especially if there's some sort of rotation, you might get 500 kids a week one semester and a different 500 kids a week a second semester. If you don't have the success plan established, if you don't have very clear red flags, you're going to miss a lot of kids who are struggling. And if those supports are not directly connected to those red flags, you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to support all of those kids. So that's why this is so important. Let me tell you, when I started doing this, it made, before I was working, late after work working with kids, and, all my lunch periods were taken up working with kids one-on-one individually, and I wasn't seeing any progress. So I said, I have to do something else. I've got to be able to reach more kids. I've got to be able to get to more of my kids. I started doing this red flag, and at first I did very simple red flags. So anything below an 80% triggered a red flag. And then I did a kind of a blanket support. And the better I got at it, the more specific my red flags became and the more specific my supports came. Well, here's the thing. When students struggle, it's a simple no-brainer. Here's like one thing that I did. That 80%, I had an electronic grade book. That was also my attendance book. I programmed the grade book to turn the kid's name in my attendance roster to red. So any kid who was earning below an 80% cumulatively at that particular day, on that particular day, when I took attendance, their name was red. So it was literally a red flag that I couldn't ignore. And so every day when I'm taking attendance, I know the kids who need supports. I put those supports in place ahead of time so they're ready to go as soon as the kids need them. They get the supports right away. I can batch it so I can take care of several different kids at one time. And then once they got the supports, kids started responding. And the ones who didn't respond to those early supports, those were the ones I focused on for more intensive remediation and support. So it actually saved me time. The key is you've got to do it ahead of time. Now, I've seen several of you say you want to learn more about the success plan. So at the end, when we do Q&A, Adrian, can you remind me to tell people more about the success plan? And then I'll make sure that I do that at the end and give you a link to where you can actually download some materials to help you create your own success plan. Okay, now, we've gotten kids out of the valley of despair, and now we're in informed optimism. So now kids need a different kind of support, a different kind of help, because now they're in informed optimism. And this is really where that reteaching and reassessment formula really happens. So there's some learning, there's some formative assessment, there's corrective action, and then there's reassessment. So I'm going to wade into a little controversial waters here, so forgive me. But I really believe that if kids only have one shot to be successful, they're going to be in trouble. And so we have to really give students multiple opportunities for assessment and for reteaching if we're going to help them to maintain that momentum and actually reach success. Students at this stage, remember, they've just come out of the valley of despair, and now they have some informed optimism, but that's very fragile. And it can be taken away at a moment's notice when they take a quiz. They've been trying, they see some progress, they take a quiz or take some sort of assessment, they do poorly on it, and they don't have another opportunity to try again. If you want to maintain their motivation, if you want to maintain their momentum, you really, really, really have to offer them an opportunity for reteaching and reassessment. And so let's talk about it. I worked in a school once where the grading and reporting policy changed overnight, literally, and we all of a sudden had to reteach and reassess. It was mandatory, and the other thing was we could not give zeros. So here's what we learned to do, and so I'm going to give you kind of a quick way to do the reteaching cycle in a way that doesn't make you crazy. So the first thing is that students learn, and you're doing all these supports so that you're setting them up to be successful. There may be a few students who, when they take that formative assessment, they didn't do so well. Now, people always worry, well, if you give them an opportunity to reassess, they won't try the first time. Not true, especially with the strategies I'm about to share with you. And the other concern is, I don't want to create a lot of extra work for myself. Well, that's why proactive intervention, that success plan, is so important, because if you know that you're going to reteach and reassess, you plan for it ahead of time. When you're creating your assessments, you can do things like, rather than create 2 assessments, you can split it in half. One of the things I love to do is find a teacher in a different school who's teaching the same thing I'm teaching, and we switch tests. My test is the main test, their test is the reassessment. There are all different kinds of different strategies to make reassessment manageable. But here's the key, and this is what keeps kids from gaming the system, and this is what helps kids be successful on that reassessment. Before they take the reassessment, they must engage in corrective action. What do I mean by that? Well, before you're allowed to come in and retest, you have to do something. And that's where that proactive intervention, that success plan comes into play. Because I've anticipated, remember, where are they going to struggle and what kind of intervention will help them. So when they want to reassess, you're fine. Anybody, if you got a 93 and you want to go for the 95, that's fine. If you got a 62 and you really want to get a higher grade, that's fine. In fact, if you got a 62, you're required to reassess. But when they take that reassessment, that before they're allowed to do it, they have to engage in corrective action. Maybe that's working with me after school. Maybe that's doing an online tutorial. Maybe that's watching a simulation of a process that I didn't get the first time so that I really can get it. It's re-engaging in that material in a new and different way. And then after they've done that corrective action, only then are they allowed to reassess. And the reassessment, my rule is that you can reassess as much as you want for formative assessments. You can't reassess the summative. Now, that's my rule. Other people have different rules, but my rule is that because the whole point of all the learning is to get you to the point where you're ready for the summative assessment. So rather than reassessing the big tests and putting your grading and reporting further and further behind, you can reassess during the formative assessments, and then that way you can just focus on reassessing for you're reassessing for the formative assessments as a way of preparing students for the summative assessments. The other thing is that you can choose the time, place, and the mode of corrective action. The students can weigh in if you want, but you can also make that your requirement. So some teachers say, okay, corrective action happens, you have to have it by this date. And here's the thing, you can reassess all the way up to the summative assessment, but after the summative assessment, no more reassessment, your grade stands. Here's the third thing. You can reassess, your second grade stands. So if you have a student who's got the 93 and wants to go for the 95, you can try it, but your second grade stands. I don't give you an average, I don't give you a pick of the best grade, your second grade stands. Why? Because the corrective action is designed to help you improve. So I don't have to average, it's not a gamble, we're not Vegas, this isn't a slot machine, try your luck. No, this is a real part of a learning process. Now here's the thing, you're sharing this with students all ahead of time. This is the way you run your class. So that when students come in from the day one, they and their parents know that they are expected to struggle productively, but now they're expected to struggle productively and there's supports in place to help them do that. Someone asked earlier, what about a student's motivation? We won't have time today to get into everything that I teach about motivation. We're doing a live workshop here in DC in the fall. If you're interested, I can tell you more about that. And then we also have some online resources if you're really interested in the motivation piece. But here's what I can tell you. When you have this process, when it's communicated ahead of time, when this is woven into the very fabric of the way that you operate your classroom, when students know, no matter where they are in that cycle of failure, that they're going to get the supports that they need to be successful, that's when your students take the risk. That's when they're motivated. That's when they're engaged. So you can overcome a huge amount of motivation issues simply by putting these things into place without doing a single other motivation strategy. You can get this, you can reach a huge number of students and overcome a huge amount of motivation issues. A lot of motivation issues at their heart, they're there because students feel so they're stuck in that valley of despair. Well, there's a lot that we talked about today that prevents students from being in a valley of despair, and there's a lot that we talked about that helps them no matter what stage they are. So I want to summarize that briefly and make sure that we have time for questions. So you also want to think about some growth-oriented strategies. I've seen some people in the chat talk about growth orientation and that sort of thing. We talked about this a little bit earlier. When students succeed or when they fail, you want to do it both, not just when they fail, but when they're successful too. Ask them what strategy they use. And it's really important to use growth-oriented feedback when you get kids who are in that informed optimism piece. Because if they don't have feedback that really focuses them on how their effort results in a competent performance, if they don't have feedback that keeps their focus on effort rather than a value judgment on themselves, if they don't have feedback that shows them how to turn failure into success, then they will not stay in that informed optimism and they're never, ever going to get to success. Okay, Now, they're telling me that I'm okay about going a little past my hour, so that's good because I do want to address some of your questions. But before I do that, I really want to talk about the success piece. Remember, productive struggle is what helps kids experience success time and time again, not just in your classroom, but in life. And your students become more resilient, they take more risk, they stop being afraid to fail. And so that's what's so important. And your students become more self-directed. They become more empowered to take ownership over their own learning, especially when you use that success plan. So here's my experience. When students know that you've anticipated their confusion, that you have a plan for them, when you share with them the red flags that you're talking about, here's what happens. Your students will start to come to you and they'll start to say things like, hey, I think I just triggered a red flag here. And they'll come to you and they'll start asking for support because they know when they're struggling. So it's really important to put those things in place because that's what empowers your students to be more self-directed, to take more ownership over their own learning. And the other thing is that when you start to create productive struggle in the classroom, it's really seductive because we all love learning. We all love it. And so your students become more meaningfully engaged in their own learning because you've given them the keys to it. You're not telling them, sit back, be passive recipients of my knowledge. What you're saying is, you have an active role to play, and I'm going to empower you with everything you need to do that. The struggle you hit, that's part of the learning process. I want you to taste it. It's delicious. Don't be afraid of it. And the more you communicate that, the more your students are going to begin to be meaningfully engaged in their own learning. Here's the last thing. And this is not just a student benefit. This is a benefit for you. When you have anticipated confusion, when you have a plan in place before you ever walk into a classroom for exactly how you're going to support your students, you're going to feel more confident, you're going to feel more competent because you're not worried about what's happening in the classroom. You can be fully present in the classroom. You don't have to worry about your students struggling because you know the moment you see a red flag, you already have a support in place. You're not scrambling at the last minute. It's already there and it's already in place for you. Now, let's summarize. Understanding the cycle of failure helps you know when and how to intervene in order to keep students struggling productively rather than destructively. And so remember, depending on where students are in the cycle of failure, that's what's going to determine your intervention because they need different things. So if students are in the uninformed optimism stage, that's really where you have to work on anticipating confusion, telling kids, you know what, you're doing fine right now, but in a minute, you're going to struggle in this area. You're going to hit this bump. That's okay. That's a part of the learning process. And when you hit that bump, I'm ready for you. I have supports in place. If students are in informed pessimism, that's when you're going to use acceleration strategies because kids are starting to say, oh, this is really, really hard. I'm struggling. And so what you're going to do is you're going to say, you don't worry about it. Here's something that's going to help you for what's coming up next. Here's something that's going to help you for the thing that you're worried about down the line. This is what you're going to put in place. When kids are in the valley of despair, that's when that proactive intervention comes into place because you're saying, look, I was ready for you before you got here. And I have some things that are going to get you out of here. So trust me. Try these strategies. We can get you out of them. So you're giving them hope. And if kids are at that informed optimism, in order to maintain that momentum, you've got to do that reteaching, reassessing, and those growth-oriented strategies, that growth-oriented feedback. When you do all of that, that's when you get to success. That's when your students achieve that success that you were hoping that they would have. And not only that, when they go through the next assignment or the next cycle of learning, they now have this behind them. They've seen themselves get through that whole cycle successfully. So now they're resilient. Now they have a little grit because you've gotten them through that whole cycle successfully. Okay, now, a couple of things. First of all, if you want to stay in touch with me, simply text the word Mindsteps to the number 33444. That way you can stay in touch. I send out weekly teaching and leadership tips, and I'd love for you to join our community that way. You can also reach out to me directly on Twitter. My handle is @Robyn Mindsteps, and I'm monitoring that account all the time. So a question occurs to you, you're welcome to reach out to me on Twitter if we run out of time today. Also, if you go to mindstepsinc.com, that's my website, and we have tons of teaching tips and strategies on the website already. So I'm going to switch over and do a little Q&A, and one of the big questions I have on Q&A is people want the success plan details and the resources for motivation. So let me start with the success plan. On our website, if you go to mindstepsinc.com/support, we have a free webinar that explains to you how all the stages of that success plan and the different things to be able to set it up. Plus, we have free downloads you can use so that you can build your own success plan. Now, for motivation, I have 2 resources for you. The first is that this fall we are doing a motivation intensive. It's a 2-day intensive here in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And for 2 days, we're going to be working with a very small group of people. So it's very intimate. We're not taking any more than 100 people. And during those 2 days, we're going to help you figure out your most pressing student motivation challenges. So when you walk out 2 days later, you have a customized plan for how you're going to motivate your kids. I'm also going to share with you some of my best strategies for motivating students, including understanding and unpacking and untangling your students' key will drivers and figuring that out too. So that's here. If you want to learn more about that, there you go to mindstepsinc.com, go to the main page, and you'll see the Motivate Your Students, Motivate Yourself banner there. The second thing is at mindstepsinc.com/motivation. Then that's what on that link you can get free motivation strategies as well. So materials, I think there's a free webinar there as well. So here are some questions. Here's the first one. What is one thing you'd like for me to share with pre-service teachers on this topic? If I had to drill it down to one thing, the thing is this: the more proactive you are, the less kids fall into destructive struggle. The main reason kids fall into destructive struggle is that the teachers are not proactive. They have not anticipated their struggle, and they don't have supports in place ahead of time. So with pre-service teachers, it's really important for them to place a lot of value on anticipating confusion, planning. That's really, really important. The second thing is understanding the difference between productive and destructive struggle. Okay, so make sure that they understand that difference, and I'm giving you a graphic on these slides to help them understand that difference. So discussing that with them, really important, so they can recognize when kids are heading for a destructive struggle and get them turned around, and they know what productive struggle looks like. What's our next question? Do we do on this slide? Okay. How do you help a student overcome test anxiety or defeated attitude before they start to test? Again, I can't stress enough how proactive work can help with that, and especially acceleration. So think about it. We talked about acceleration earlier for assignments, but why wouldn't we also accelerate our kids for a test? Hey, we've got this test coming up. It's multiple choice. Let's talk about strategies for working through multiple choice tests. Now, the other piece that I use, and I'm going to tell my age here a little bit. When I was younger, all public buildings had a box at the end of the hall, and on that box was a sign that said, "In case of emergency, break glass." And so what I do with kids who have anxiety, test anxiety, is I always give them a break glass strategy. What do you do when you're in the test and you get stuck? And we practice that break glass strategy ahead of time. So it may be something like, if you're stuck on a multiple choice question, I show them how to figure out whether to skip the multiple choice question, or how to guess effectively. Or so whatever that break glass, if you get stuck on an essay, what do you write instead? What's a go-to heuristic that you use? Whatever it is, I give them that break glass strategy, and we practice it ahead of time so that when they get in the middle of the test, they feel more confident because they have that break glass strategy in their back pocket. Okay, what's our next question? Looks like we're still looking at, so we just did the test anxiety question. Do we have another question after that? Okay, while you're working on that, I see a question here from Teresa from Silver Spring. Is reteaching your main support? No. We have several supports in place. In fact, if you go to mindstepsinc.com/support, I think we have a list of corrective actions on there. I'm not sure if it's still up, but we have created a list of alternative corrective actions. And there are other supports as well. So, and how to support struggling students, there's a whole section. I think that we have 18 different supports that you can use, and we explain how to use them and when to use them in that book. So no, reteaching is not our main support, because that is very time, resource, and labor intensive, and sometimes you don't need to give students reteaching. Sometimes there are other things that you need to do as well. Okay, so Tanya is asking, I find it difficult to come up with inquiry that can be accessed by all students, both strong and weak. It is also a challenge to group students to maximize their learning. Any suggestions? Okay, I do, and I have a couple of suggestions, and I'm going to try to keep, I don't have quick suggestions, so I'm going to try to address this as well as I can, in this kind of format, and then I'll tell you also where you can get more. Typically, I believe in, with differentiated instruction, I believe that you differentiate up, never down. So you're not taking something and taking away some of the challenge from it. What you're doing is you're scaffolding kids so to the point where they're able to access that challenge. So what I believe that you have to do is that you take the inquiry lesson and you write a strong inquiry, or as strong as you can get it. And then what you do is, for the students who are struggling, you differentiate by providing scaffolds and supports that help them access that inquiry. The students who are not struggling, the students who need extra challenge, you take that inquiry and you either expand or contract it. So let me see if I can come up with a quick example about what I mean by expanding or contracting it. Let's say that, I don't know what it is that you teach, but let's say that you have an inquiry where students are they're trying to discover, I'll do a history one. They're looking at identifying specific causes for migration from groups from one area to the next area. So they're tracking migration. And so you're creating an inquiry project around that. If you were to expand that, if you have students say maybe they're tracking one group and they're looking at the migration patterns of a specific group of people, if you were to expand that, you would look at the migration patterns for a specific group of people, and you would also maybe add to that something. So they're looking at migration patterns for a specific group of people, and you're also tracking animal migrations to see if there's a relation between the two. So you're not making a new task, you're just giving students an additional kind of tweak to that task that makes it way more challenging. If you're contracting it, let's say you're studying migration patterns of a specific group of people, you might contract it by looking at it over only a specific period of time, or you might contract it by looking at migration patterns. If there's a large or vast migration pattern, they're narrowing it in some sort of way. So with stronger students who need more challenge, what you do is take that same task and expand or contract it. For struggling students, what you do is you take that same task and you put scaffolds at each stage of the task that help students reach that task. So rather than trying to come up with different inquiry tasks, that's a lot harder. Make a really good one, figure out how you scaffold struggling students to get to it, and then figure out how you tweak it by expanding or contracting it to help with the stronger students. All right, are there any other questions or follow-up questions to what I've shared so far? What websites do you recommend that can be used for students who struggle? I'm assuming you're talking about online resources, and a lot of that depends on what it is that you teach. So one of the things that we often do in our Supporting Struggling Students workshop is we spend some time helping teachers explore the internet to look for specific strategies for their subject area. So one of the things that I would recommend that you do is, if you teach a particular grade level or particular subject area, you send out that inquiry to teachers in your particular area and ask them what they're using. So I can't give you specific websites, but let me tell you the kind of websites that I think are really important. If you're teaching something that has to do with a process, so let's say you're doing science or something that has to do with a process that's very visual, I love websites that give students simulations or narrated simulations. If you're teaching in the upper levels, I love to use college and university websites that have further explanation on different topics, or tutorials and simulations that way. Most of the time, teachers that I work with find the best success by doing something like addition tutorial or cell osmosis simulation, and just Googling that and then looking at websites that come up, so that you can do that with your particular topic. Another one that I love, or another type of website that I love, are the websites where you can do your own quizzes, because you can do a lot of your reassessments online, so that you don't have to be in front of kids. So if they want to do a reassessment, they can do a quiz online, or they can do a practice quiz online as a corrective action, where they go through and take that practice quiz, and then you get the results, and then that lets you know that they're ready for the in-person quiz. So three types of websites. I love simulations, I love tutorials, and then I love websites where you can create online assessments, because you can create things that you can use to help students refine their skills. Okay, what other questions do we have? What about learning support students? Well, this actually works really well with students who are learning support students, and especially if you're in a co-teaching model, because a lot of times what you can do, especially if you've agreed on red flags for those students, then you can work together to support those students, and while you're teaching, your co-teacher is looking out for red flags and supporting all students. The other thing is, I'll tell you a quick story just to show you how successful this is. The acceleration piece is critical for learning support students, because you're setting them up to be successful, and often these students need multiple exposures to material to make it work. So in one school where we worked, we took the 20 failing students, a lot of them whom were learning support students, and they were already working with a special educator. And what we did was, a couple of days a week, they worked with a special educator, and all the special educator did was accelerate. She previewed vocabulary and learning strategies for upcoming assignments. After doing that for an entire semester, the 20 kids who were struggling the most in the school, none of them was earning anything less than a C, and this is in a middle school. So I know firsthand that acceleration works really well for learning support students. I think we should be doing a lot more of it. I think that we should be working a lot more closely with our special education staff, sharing with them what we're doing, what those key concepts are, what they could be previewing, because those students thrive. They're a lot more confident in the classroom when they have that kind of support. Are there any other questions? Haven't had this one answered yet. Are there materials to share with parents in partnership with school efforts to promote productive struggle? Okay, so there are not necessarily materials that I know of that are pre-printed materials, but here is what I do with parents in partnership with school efforts. That success plan that I use, where especially the part where I create the red flag and the immediate support that comes with the red flag, I definitely share that with parents. And in fact, in How to Support Struggling Students, in the appendices, I show you an elementary example, a middle school example, and a high school example of how I share that with students and parents. That's not your secret. You should share that with students and parents. And here's what it does. It does a couple of things. First of all, parents see that you are supporting and that you have a plan in place to support their students, so they begin to trust you more. Secondly, those red flags give parents a language they can use to call the school when they see their students struggling. Those red flags say, this is what destructive struggle looks like. Unless you're triggering a red flag, there's no need to call, because that struggle is expected. It's normal. I'm prepared for that. But when you see students struggling in this way, that red flag says call the school. Not only that, but well, first of all, that helps parents become partners. But when parents call a school and they say, here's a red flag I'm seeing at home, the teacher can say, thanks for that information. I'll immediately get this support in place. So it helps parents and teachers partner. It gives them language around which to partner in support of their students. So even if you don't have materials that kind of explain what productive and destructive struggle are, even if you've never used that term, you can actually share your success plan with parents at the very beginning of the year. It's what I talk about on back to school night. It's what I share with parents. Sometimes I'll actually have parents sign it. So it shows that they've seen it and they're part of that process, so that they're not complaining when the interventions are in place, especially if those are inconvenient interventions. And what that does is it gets parents on board and empowers them to be partners with me in support of their kids. Okay, let's do a last question. And I want to thank all of you who have stuck it out with me well past the hour. Are there any more questions? Is there a last question? Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any more questions. That might have been our last question. So again, I just want to thank you all for spending time with me. I know how busy you are, and this is an investment, and I don't take it lightly. So if another question occurs to you, or if you're watching the replay and you have a question, again, you can reach out to me via Twitter, Robyn_Mindsteps. You can also get additional resources at the Mindsteps website, and you can also, there's a button there if you want to contact me directly there, you can as well.